welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by an author of a really gorgeous new really richly world-built fantasy that I am so excited to talk about. Welcome to the show. Hi, can I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
My name is Rosalie M. And my debut novel, Daughter of Calamity, is an adult historical fantasy set in Jazz Age Shanghai.
It is such a beautiful book. It is such a richly imagined world. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your journey towards this book. Where was your inception point? Where did the project come from? And yeah, how did this book come to be?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of interesting. I originally got kind of the seeds for this idea when I was in college, almost like 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago. I was studying abroad in China and I was actually working under the table kind of as a pole dancer in these nightclubs in Beijing. I had been taking athletic pole dance lessons in the United States, but I got an interesting opportunity to perform at two different nightclubs in Beijing. One was in the like kind of downtown student district, and the other one was in a suburb. And a lot of the kind of initial inspiration for the story came from my experience for about 6 months in those two locations, and kind of just observing nightlife and how it was really different in China than in the US. And sort of because since I danced in two different like nightclub bars, one of them was really traditionally Chinese since it was further out from the city, and the other one was like right in the city center where there's Starbucks was literally the coffee shop next to it. And it was just like very, very like I felt I wouldn't have felt different than if I was in San Francisco, which I live now almost. Except for the fact that sometimes around, even though like these areas very much like they would even have really fashionable names. Like I think in Beijing at that time, I counted four different shopping centers named Soho, which I think is actually a New York
Yeah.
thing. And there's no reason they had to be called Soho. It was irrelevant to Beijing. And it was just very much like, wow, they really, really want to be like the next New York. But at the same time, there would be kind of these ancient temples that were still there. And these are like historical monuments, but at night they're completely quiet. And kind of the juxtaposition between the nightclub space and those temples was where I got the inspiration.
Oh, that is such a great origin story. I am so drawn to that like mashup of like a very sort of modern urban type culture and these sort of like this more ancient sort of like forces that might like lie beneath it. Um, I'm so curious about like how your like almost like lived experience, like it's almost like method writing, right? Like you wrote directly about like your experience as a dancer. And I did notice that like the kind of the ecosystem of the nightclub is so like so carefully observed and so insightful. And like did the kind of the social dynamics between the dancers and like between dancers and patrons exist in the same way? Because it's so complex and so interesting.
I'm glad you think so. Yeah, kind of. It was very interesting, sort of being on a stage. I think that was my first experience really dancing on a stage because I grew up doing dance as a hobby, and I've been part of like like cheerleading groups, etc. Even when I pole danced in college, I did some competitions, or we would perform locally at my studio. But I think it's really different performing in an actual like nightlife environment where you're sort of almost kind of like in the background, not a background, but you're like an added element of kind of, I almost felt like I was like adding, I was there to create atmosphere, but almost it's kind of like putting on a projection on a TV almost. And so that was sort of really interesting. There was definitely a fourth wall that I had never felt before as a dancer. And I think that both threw me off and made it really interesting. And then during my breaks, I tried to make an effort to go out and talk to people. And so I think that was kind of where I got some of the inspiration, and talking to other dancers also, and kind of learning about their life, because I was here as a student, and this was something that I was doing because I really love dancing, and uh, I the experience just seemed like such a once in a lifetime thing. But I was dancing with people who are doing this for their entire career, and kind of I made good friends with one of my, well, she was technically the person who set me up with this opportunity, and she was one of the dance teachers that I met in a Beijing pole dance studio, but she was a career dancer, and she had a lot of really interesting insights to share. And so kind of just talking to the dancers in particular and learning about both the competition between the dancers to get spots at the best nightclubs that pay the most, in the best locations, and also kind of different interactions between the patrons and the dancers inspired Daughter of Calamity.
I love that. And it makes very good use of the way that like dancers in a nightclub, almost like taxi drivers or like other people who are like in very visible jobs, but tend to be treated as though they are invisible, by the people around them, like lets you observe a lot. And like a lot of the story kind of comes from that. Yeah, could you talk a little bit about the historical setting too and blending history and fantasy? Because it's such a vivid portrait of 1930s Shanghai, but it also has these like really gorgeous organic fantasy elements. So can you talk about what kind of research you do like to write historical fantasy?
That's a really good question. So I had the fortune of visiting Shanghai in December 2019, for the new year, and I stayed in the French concession. I actually went to the actual like Paramount Ballroom, which is a central plot event space in Daughter of Calamity, and I visited the temple next to it. And I think when I was visiting the temple next to it and kind of looking out, because previously when I danced, I'd been in the nightclubs looking at the closed temples. This time I was in the temple looking out at the nightclubs around. I had tried to go to the Paramount Ballroom, but at the time I think they quoted me, for a college student, I could not afford to the entrance fee. And so I looked at it from outside instead. And I think kind of that's where that initial inspiration came from. And then afterwards, I went home and I did some research on the time period, and I actually tried to read accounts written by dancers themselves or frequent or like nightclub goers who frequented those nightclubs. And I would find different accounts from people of different social classes from different countries. And I think I compared all of them. And in the end, I used all of them as research. I think I was most fascinated by the accounts of, there aren't that many accounts that I was able to access that were written by the cabaret dancers themselves. But there's a short story writer who's kind of gives Scott Fitzgerald vibes, in that he had a love affair with this cabaret dancer, and he made a lot of observations about that space. I studied a lot of his short stories. His name is Mu Shiying. So yeah, I think he has a collection that's been translated into English. So I read the stories both in Chinese and English, English translation, and they're slightly different in both. But in the Chinese version, and the translator did a really good job, there's this kind of ominous atmosphere that kind of reflects the urbanization that was already happening in the 1930s. So that's, I think, kind of when the like old style city started to really kind of aspire to be like at the time New York. And that kind of change has continued through almost a century now. Yeah. And so I also read accounts by Russian dance girls. There were a lot of Russian dancers who had fled to Shanghai after the revolution in Russia, and they were living there, and they were also working as dancers alongside a lot of the Chinese girls. And so Russians and Chinese girls, it was interesting that you brought up taxi drivers, because they were actually called taxi dancers.
Oh,
Yeah, and they would just be there to be partners and in exchange for dance tickets at the nightclubs.
wow. It's such an interesting world. And I think like something that the story does really well too, I think, is like kind of examine the ways in which um cultural tourism can be like a kind of soft colonialism, because like you do like touch on these like class dynamics and the sort of also like international dynamics and interpersonal and how that all wraps up together. Was that something that you found yourself thinking about like while you were writing, or?
Yeah, that was something that I thought about a lot. It was something that I had observed a lot in accounts of Shanghai that I had read, especially from the 1930s by a lot of very, very rich socialites from New York or Europe, who were in Shanghai for fun, but they were very much sort of protected from like a lot of the darker sides of the city, like a lot of the violent, or I mean, they were still affected, but I think that when I was reading those accounts, it was kind of like they were on vacation almost, and it was like this was like a fun place to visit, which is often, I mean, even for me at the time, having grown up in the United States, traveling and kind of visiting and seeing everything through my lens as this is just a temporary place I'm escaping to. And largely the dancers in the story also capitalize on that because that's kind of what they're selling. They're selling a fantasy, but at the same time, the lived experience of having that be your permanent reality is really different than just being a tourist. So I really wanted to examine that difference.
Ooh. Yeah, that is so fascinating. If we can shift for a second to sort of like the criminal underworld that you kind of imagine in this city at this time, could you explain a little bit about our protagonist, um, how she relates maybe both to like the dance world and to like the criminal elements, and then yeah, about the nature of this gang? 'Cause I do have some like questions about how they present and like the dynamics are just all so interesting. Could you talk about some of that too?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Yeah, so our main character, Jingwen, is she's a dancer and she became a dancer when she was 18 years old, but she actually grew up in the clinic of her grandmother, who's a black market surgeon, who actually melts these steel swords made of a special steel called heavenly steel, and she actually makes cybernetic, almost cybernetic arms for the gangsters from belonging to the local gang, which allows them to be really powerful. And that allows at least one Chinese gang to have power in the city of Shanghai, which is otherwise very much divided and controlled by these foreign police forces from the French concession and the international settlement.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, it's so interesting. And I love the role that her grandmother plays, like sort of in this culture. I found the like almost like let's call it fantasy surgery to be so fascinating as like almost like a kind of conspicuous consumption too, in addition to all the other things that it signals. Like, could you talk about how like you thought about that, like about this like how you like using surgery and medicine as like a sort of, I guess, like to express your power in a way, you know?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. One thing that readers might notice reading Daughter of Calamity, and which I thought a lot about, is that almost in this alternate version of Shanghai, there's actually no guns, even though guns did exist at the time. Instead, the primary form of weapon that's still being used is swords and other types. And instead, I did want to kind of, the reason why I chose to include the cybernetic almost limbs, even though they're not called that because that terminology didn't exist back then, is kind of to show that in this quickly modernizing world, if the gangsters of Shanghai or if Jingwen or if the country of China itself at the time doesn't want to fall behind, they have to embrace technology. There's no way they can't embrace technology, especially if there is so much foreign influence from these countries that have already gone through their own industrial revolution. And so I really wanted to examine kind of the aspect of when the world is rapidly industrializing and that they are taking over kind of your city. If you want to kind of maintain your own identity and push back, you have to embrace technology. I think there's no choice, whether you like it or not. And in the novel, I examine a lot of reasons to like it and to not like it. But ultimately, Jingwen realizes that that she makes the decision, which is kind of a morally gray decision, that she does want to progress forward, and that in the end, and so does the Blue Dawn, which is the gang in Shanghai. The gangs in the story were actually inspired by the gangs that were in Shanghai in 1930s, which actually descended from kind of the former martial sects, like kind of sword fighting sects that you see in martial arts films. They eventually became the gang, or a lot of the gangs in Shanghai, if you look at their history, they use the same terminology that was used historically by these sword fighting sects and martial arts sects. So I thought for the story, it'd be really interesting to adapt what they've always done, sword fighting, and kind of turn it into its own technology. And I chose to do that through the steel arms, silver arms. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's so cool. And it's such a great image. And I really think it speaks to the way in which like there are so many like transitions happening in this novel. Like the city itself is in transition, as you were just saying, between like industrialization and what came before. Jing Wen is like in her own sort of intergenerational transition, sort of deciding if she wants to follow in her grandmother's footsteps or not, and what that transition of power is going to do. Like, can you maybe talk a little bit about like how the moment of transition that the city finds itself in kind of like resonates with like what's going on inside Jingwen?
Yeah, I think kind of the change, the intergenerational change for Jingwen in 1930 Shanghai is probably a pretty common experience that's experienced by immigrants or anyone who has moved or found themselves growing up in a really different era than the one that perhaps their parents or grandparents grew in, which even now in 2024 is probably still a relatable experience, which is kind of why I chose to center that. It's kind of like the diaspora question, where even though Jingwen has not physically moved anywhere, even within Shanghai, just culturally, things have changed so much from when her grandmother was a surgeon in a small warlord's army, kind of before the government became the way it was, and kind of dealing with both the cultural shift and the differences in technology, the differences in what's valued, because Jingwen is sort of like a modern girl, as the archetype is called. She likes makeup, she likes dancing, she embraces her femininity, versus her grandmother still comes from an era where if you want to be seen as strong, you want to embody more, at the time, traditionally masculine kind of values, such as being a doctor, etc., being involved with the gangs, and kind of these two different type ways that Jiwan's grandmother and her view power and what's considered powerful is a question that I explore a lot.
Wow. It's also, as I said before, so richly imagined. It's a really gorgeously built world. And I cared about all these characters like very quickly. And, I loved it so much. And thank you for sharing it with us and for coming to talk about your book to our listeners. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the podcast.
All right, listeners, it's now your turn. You're going to check out Daughter of Calamity. Go to your favorite independent bookstore, your favorite library, wherever you like to go get your books, and check it out. It's a really beautiful story, and I think you'll really fall in love with it the way that I did. Thank you so much for joining us. It's time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.